Hello there, loves. Welcome back to Ann World Peace. I'm your host, Maggie Gehlsen-Burnett. Today we have our first official part 2 episode. So we have our first guest who is joining us, who has already been on the show. It will be her second time making an appearance on this podcast. Now, if you know me, you know that as of late, one thing that I cannot shut the fuck up about is the concept of sort of the crunchy to alt-right pipeline, misinformation online as it relates to health and wellness, sort of like these pseudoscience-y folks who will hop on podcasts with major followings and have their messages heard, and sort of how we have gotten to a place in America where we are consuming so much content that does contain misinformation. So I wanted to bring somebody on the show who could talk about this with me because it's way more fun to gab with someone else than it is to gab alone. So I have my lovely friend Erin Dittmer, who is joining us again on the podcast. Now, you might remember from the last episode that Erin is a mom of 2. She's a content creator. She's a business owner. She also has her Bachelor's of Science in Public Health. She has an MBA, and she previously worked as a wellness coach and childhood nutrition educator. Before having children, she spent years teaching nutrition lessons to elementary school students through the SNAP-funded Pick a Better Snack initiative. The program is designed to influence children's food choices by helping them become more familiar with fruits and vegetables, learn fun ways to eat them, and increase their overall consumption at school and at home. Erin is passionate about improving social determinants of health, namely education quality and access, affordable housing and neighborhood safety, economic stability, healthcare, and social policies that uplift our communities. This was such an amazing episode, so much fun. I loved gabbing with Erin. First of all, she is just full of knowledge as it relates to the health and wellness spaces and sort of how we consume information. Erin and I also have a very deep love and vested interest in politics, and so that obviously plays a role in all of this. So it really was just a great time to chat with somebody who has similar interests in the same Roman empires as I do. Now, as usual, you will find any and all resources from this episode listed in the show notes. We will have Erin's information down there. We will have a few other people that we both really find to be incredibly knowledgeable who are doing just the Lord's work online as it relates to helping the misinformation epidemic that is happening in real time online right now, especially with an election looming. So be sure to check out the show notes for all of those good details. All right, without further ado, let's welcome Erin back to the show. You actually, I think, are my first repeat guest on the show, which is super exciting. So today we're going to chat about something a little bit different, which is sort of the concept of like misinformation in the health space online, how politics plays a role in all of this, crunchy to alt-right pipeline, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my first question, I want to start out by asking you, because you are a health practitioner, you do nutrition education, you have your master's in nutrition, MBA, but then you have your undergrad is in
public health.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So you're a nutrition educator. So I want to know about your firsthand experience with observing this misinformation online as it relates to health.
Yeah. So what has been a very interesting crossover lately is the childhood nutrition piece, because I worked as a childhood nutrition educator for years before I even had kids, and seeing what is being pushed in regard to this is the solution for helping our kids become healthy is so insidious, because one, it's based on a lot of misinformation. Two, the information that we actually have from public health experts and the programs I have worked on that are or were making an impact are not even referenced. It is so focused on single ingredients. It's not focused on overall health. It's not focused on the systems at play that are causing the obesity epidemics or the metabolic health issues. So that has been really interesting, just from working as a childhood nutrition educator to now seeing what they're saying is the issue in childhood nutrition. It's night and day. Like, it's so there's so much misinformation. So yeah, I'm really
Yeah.
excited to talk more about that.
So when okay, so I have so many things. I have a bazillion questions in my brain. The first being, well, you referenced metabolic health, and I want to touch back on metabolic health because that was like the cornerstone topic of conversation at the RFK Junior Roundtable. So I want to circle back to metabolic health in a moment. When you are observing this in the space with children,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think that Instagram and social media plays a role in all of this? Because so many people that I know who, let's be clear, I'm not friends with, but people that I know, we don't associate with them, get their content, get their quote news, their science, whatever from places like Instagram. So, how do you think that that plays a role in the way that people are deciding to feed their children, cook for their children, all of those things?
I think it is a lot of misguided and misdirected fear. So there's so much fear over these single ingredients that have been rigorously studied. Food dyes are one of the most regulated and rigorously studied ingredients in our food. On the contrary, the supplement industry is one of the most unregulated industries. So these influencers that are promoting fear mongering really around things like red dyes, organic versus inorganic food, GMOs. Most people don't even know what a GMO is in this community because they don't educate them on it. You know what I mean? They throw out all
Yeah,
these buzzwords and they don't even have the conceptualization to realize that if we just got rid of all GMOs, our food supply would drastically drop. We would not have enough food to supply for our nation. And GMOs, in fact, can prevent our ability or can prevent pesticide use. So if you create a genetically modified organism that is more resistant to pests, you can actually use less pesticide. So that's just an example of how they latch on to this buzzword and they say these are poisoning us or these are
right.
toxic, but they don't understand the intrinsic reasons why we are creating those and all of the science behind it and all the money that has gone into this is to overall help us as a society. And I think when they throw out these buzzwords, it's easy for people to feel so empowered and they
Mm,
feel like they have like an inside look into this information when in reality there's no nuance in what they're saying and it's such a nuanced topic that it's impossible to actually have an understanding on what we need to do as a society and as a government and as whoever what we
yeah.
need to do to move this conversation forward and actually prevent illness. And
Hmm.
instead we're just helping suburban moms have anxiety when they're at the grocery store and shopping for, the processed foods that in
Yeah.
itself could be problematic.
You mentioned like within the GMOs and using pesticides, and that made me instantly think of the like shot heard around the world that is the Roundup weed killer
Yeah.
conversation and like how people said that they were putting Roundup into Bonza pasta, and I remember everybody like freaking out about this. And then I mean, this entire concept, this entire conversation, this industry really is so reliant upon constant contradictions. So, like, they're
Yes.
saying that, like, this Roundup weed killer is in our food, but then they don't want, GMOs to be created and then they don't want pesticides to be used on our food, so then people create GMOs,
Mhm.
so it's really fascinating to see how many contradictions like exist within this topic alone.
Yes. And within the contradictions, the empowerment I feel like fuels those contradictions because they feel so empowered to speak on them, and they give them all these kind of like talking points, like such and such is poisoning us, and Kellogg's needs to get rid of their food dyes because their food dyes are giving us obesity and all these things. And there just hasn't been scientific evidence to prove what they're saying. But because people feel like they have the inside scoop and they feel like they're these independent thinkers, they just roll with it. And they don't even see the contradictions within themselves. And these are the
Right.
people that are also complaining about grocery prices. Well, guess what? If we remove all these things that you think are toxic, our grocery prices are going to skyrocket.
Yeah.
And there is one clear candidate right now who is talking about making price gouging illegal. The other candidate is calling any sort of regulation on price gouging communism. So there is a clear distinction here between the policies that are actually going to help and the policies that are just trying to, or lack thereof, concepts of policies that aren't actually going
Yeah.
to push forward any health improvements in our society.
Concepts of policies. I'm
Concepts of
crying.
policies.
I have a concept of a plan.
Oh my God.
Okay, so wait, really quick before we get into like any other questions. Why do you think the dyes, the food dyes, is like the thing that people latch on to? Like, I have heard so many things about like red dye 40 and like fucking yellow dye, whatever the fuck it is. And I'm just so curious to know, like, why do you think that specifically was was do you know if there was like initially a study that came out that like said something about it causing cancer, and that's why people are decided that this was the one thing they were going to latch on to?
There was a study done years ago that it was a behavioral analysis. I believe it was double blind. So they noticed that some of the children that were given red dye or yellow dye, there might have been a few others, I can't remember specifically which one it was, did have like increased hyperactivity after eating whatever it was that they had put this food dye in. The
So people
problem,
are scared of neurodivergence. Got it.
and I think the reason, bingo, I think the reason that they're latching on to this food dye and the hyperactivity is because it assuages the guilt that parents have upon giving their children processed food. Because then it turns it into, you know what? You're doing fine. Keep giving your kids processed food. This isn't your fault. This is their fault. This is the corporations that put the red dye in your kids' food that make your kids act this way. When in reality, there are so many confounding factors that contribute to a child's hyperactivity, and blaming it on food dye is so asinine and so just ignorant, truly.
Right.
I try not to bring like any sort of like you're uneducated, blah, 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 because I think that can make people immediately stop listening and immediately have pushback. But when we look at something like hyperactivity, acting like food dye is the reason your kids are acting like that. It's just scientifically not proven. And when they looked at those studies too, there was one that was done a few years after this initial one they're talking about that I think showed an increase in the children that already had hyperactivity, already had ADHD. So I
Hmm.
think it's great if you know your child has that, there are options for you to not give your child food dye. There actually are quite a few companies that are creating products that are food dye free. You can look at a label, you can find out whether it has it in it or not. That's for your child. So it's taking this very individualistic problem and then making it a much like larger I don't know, it's kind of like making it a scapegoat, really.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at processed food as a whole and price gouging as an issue and how can we make whole foods more accessible and teach people how to cook with these whole foods and make them nutritious and delicious for their family, we're like, we don't really want to do all of that. So let's just get mad about food dye.
Wait until people hear that neurodivergence is predominantly genetic.
Yes. Like, have you met your husband?
Like,
I,
girl.
I think we could, point some or connect some dots here if we,
Yeah, right.
and that's the thing that's really hard about this conversation is you don't want to make people feel worse. I would never want a mom
Right.
to feel like she is, you know, somehow at fault for her child's neurodivergence or behavioral issues. But I think using the food dye is really, really misleading.
Mm-hmm.
And even if slash when, because I'm sure eventually they'll be taking them out. When we remove these certain food dyes, we're still not addressing the underlying issue, which is healthy food is too expensive.
Mm-hmm.
It is inaccessible to many communities. That is a whole systemic issue that I think a lot of white suburban moms, quite frankly, don't even know. They don't even understand
Yeah.
that that's an issue in these communities that are food deserts that truly do not have access to
Mm-hmm.
healthy foods. But yeah, I could go on and on about the ways to prevent that. We actually did community nights where we would bring in a healthy food and we would teach people the importance of it, how there's, for instance, beans. We did a night on beans. We taught people how to cook with beans. You can easily add them to like a jarred salsa to boost the fiber content, increase satiety, and make this a healthier choice for your family. We taught them how to make hummus. Like there are ways to introduce healthy foods to people in a way that empowers them instead of leads them to feeling more anxiety towards making healthy choices for their kids.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That that really is so fascinating too, that when you consider how suburban moms, likely white suburban women, are likely not considering how many factors are at play when we're discussing food and health.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and they just sort of assume that it's as simple as blaming a singular entity, a corporation, for putting a dye in, blaming XYZ candidate for whatever thing that they did during their time in office,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, and then resorting to these accounts that are incredibly fear mongering, these supplement companies that promise that they'll do something for them in return, for their dollar. And I just think that that is so insidious. It is so detrimental to like our culture as a
Yeah.
whole, our society as a whole. So I want to know how you think that this entire conversation about misinformation around health
Mm-hmm.
specifically impacts and likely disproportionately impacts women. So, how do you think women are really on the receiving end of this conversation?
That's such a good question. And I think it comes down to the burden of the mental burden, the like chore burden, there's a really good book called Seven Deadly Sins and the Price That You Have to Pay to Be a Woman. Have you read
I
that one?
fucking love this book.
I can't think of what the title is. I'm thinking of what's underneath of it. I'm
It's
literally reading it for the second time.
I almost said Ask Not, but that's the book I'm reading about the Kennedy. But fuck, she was on Kate Kennedy's podcast, and that's how I heard about her
I
and
know.
this book. Anyway, yeah, I know what book you're talking about, though.
Yeah. So I think we just have so much of the burden of like cooking meals for our family, keeping our family healthy, doing the research. I mean, you even talk about like doctor's appointments and things like that. Like women are just more likely to be the ones taking their children to the doctor's appointments, setting the appointments, whatever. Like I know that's not everyone's family because like
Mhm,
my husband does potentially even more of that than I do. He's
mhm,
like an amazing, very involved parent. But because we live in a world where the expectation generally falls on the women for those kind of things, I think they have a lot more guilt around what am I supposed to be feeding my child. And then that turns to, oh, look, this shiny solution of us marching in front of Kellogg's and getting them to take food diet, that's what we need to do. And a lot of people, I think, will say, well, it's a first step. And I think as a response to that, we can't make a step until we look at the big picture, because you can't say that
Mm-hmm.
is the best first step to take, because it's not. I
Yeah.
personally don't think it is the best first step to take, because I think what it's doing is it's creating a lot of fear around single ingredients. I see comments and people will say, I don't even know what to buy anymore. And it's like, you don't have to buy anything with food dye in it. That's totally fine. But the
Yeah.
fact that processed foods are the most affordable to most families, and our government isn't, if our government does not address price gouging, it is going to make processed foods continue to be the most accessible and the most affordable.
Yeah.
And I think that is the bigger problem here, is how can we make healthy whole foods more accessible to people? And then there's the other nuanced aspect of this, is how do they have time to prepare it,
Mm.
when in America our amount of leave and our work schedule is just absolutely overkill.
Yeah.
And so people hardly even have time to make these meals. And then we
Mm-hmm.
have, on the other end of the spectrum, people working two jobs because their job isn't giving them enough money to work one job because of
Mm-hmm.
these corporations, thinking the 44-year failure of trickle down economics is somehow going to start working. You know what I mean? It's like, this is why these conversations are so complex, because there are so many factors at play for our nation's obesity epidemic. Food dye is not the reason we are obese.
Right. Yeah. So this all leads me back to this topic of metabolic health, which
Yeah.
was the sort of cornerstone topic of the health roundtable that RFK Jr. held. He had a bunch of different people who spoke on this panel. Namely, I would say like Casey Means was probably one of the biggest names on the panel. I think Max, what's his face, might have also been there. Louv Louvigier or whatever his name is. Anyway, so this all kind of like leads to when politicians are hosting things like this, hosting these like health roundtables, and you have these incredibly educated, really smart doctors who are speaking on this panel being like, we have a metabolic crisis in America. Like, people are dying. We have the highest rate of cancer, blah, 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 whatever. How do we assess that information critically? Like, I think I looked at that and I was sort of like, okay, but we also have made incredible strides in terms of like, cancer research and research surrounding our health, generally speaking. So, how do we, people who may hear stuff like that from these, again, incredibly educated people who have, degrees from Stanford and places of that nature, how are we able to think critically around those conversations when like so much of that is likely a fear-mongering tactic?
Mhm. I think one of the first things we can ask ourselves, whether we're listening to a panel in Congress or we're listening to someone on social media, is really questioning their credentials and their motivation behind what they're saying. So, for instance, there was a doctor who talks a lot about nutrition, who I believe was trained as an otolaryngologist, an ear, nose, and throat doctor. Why are we listening to an
Girly, what? I have more nutrition. I actually did the math on this, that I have a minor in nutrition,
Mhm.
and I have more hours of nutrition classes under my belt than this specific doctor that we are referring to. So,
So I think just, doctor is used, or like a lot of people, I've seen a lot of nurses over the COVID epidemic
mm,
say, I'm a nurse, and use that as some sort of reason to believe them without asking any more questions.
right.
And so we can hear things like, our percentage of people with heart disease in this country is really concerning. We can hear things like the number of Americans that have diabetes is really concerning. But when people talk about these things with no nuance, I think that is really when you should be skeptical, because
Mm-hmm.
they are acting like they have this perfect solution to the problem, and that makes people feel empowered. But what I loved about that Caro and Katie's podcast is they said
Yeah.
it's like a pyramid scheme. That's
It is.
exactly what
Yes.
it feels like. And for you and I, who are very familiar with the MLM industry, when I heard that, it was like a light bulb, went off
Yeah.
went on, because what they're doing is these quote unquote experts are making a lot of money. There is so much money in being a reactionary centrist these days. And so what
Yeah.
they're doing is they're acting like they have no biases. They're acting like they are coming from this clean slate of, I am a individual independent thinker, that I'm not paid like the FDA is paid. You know what I mean? Like they're trying to remove themselves from any culpability of
Mm-hmm.
being paid for by any other like industry. But what
Yeah.
they're
Right.
doing, they're paid by us, by
Yeah.
our consumption. And so
Mm-hmm.
the more inflammatory their statements can be, and the more controversial, especially when it comes to like Instagram posts, the more
Yeah.
money they make, the more products
Mm.
they sell, the more books they sell. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but as I was literally talking to my husband about this, I pulled up my phone to show him an article about something. And if it wasn't Jillian Michaels shilling her supplement powder in an ad in that article, I was like, this is all I need to show you. Like, this is what I have been saying. These people do not have the best interest of the consumer at heart. The people who
Yeah.
do are the experts that rigorously study these things, go
Mm-hmm.
in to a science lab and have to test the exact same thing over and over and over again. I don't think people understand how mundane and how just difficult of a job that is, to
Yeah.
go in and do these science experiments every day to try to prove something that you've literally dedicated your life to. And you
Mm-hmm.
may not even be able to find the answers that you're looking for. So to
Yeah.
distrust all experts and instead place our trust in influencers, which I can criticize because I am an influencer,
Yeah.
to put our trust in influencers that are promising you all of this empowerment and health without actually giving you the tools to empower yourself or to make yourself healthier, like that should be a big red flag in your mind.
Yeah.
And it should cause you to, really question whether these people have your best interest at heart.
My therapist and I very regularly talk about black and white, all or nothing thinking, because that's
Mm,
how I have spent a majority of my life, is in this like all or nothing sort of mindset about things. And so that isn't necessarily helpful it's not really helpful in any like area of life. Maybe when we're considering like your morals, it could be useful there, but like
mm-hmm,
it's not helpful in terms of health. It's not helpful in terms of the food that I eat. It's not helpful in terms of, looking at politics and the government and how they play a role in my health.
mm-hmm,
It's not helpful at all.
mm-hmm.
And so I think that exact concept applies here perfectly,
Yeah.
that like black and white, all or nothing thinking is actually so dangerous when it comes to like not allowing that space for nuance in our health, and especially when we are sort of critiquing these influencers online
Mm-hmm,
who have to your point, no background in this, no real expertise in the work that they're doing. That is, being able to critique them is crucial. Like being able to look at it critically and be like, okay, listen, like, this, your metrics on this post were probably nuts. So it probably made you a shitload of money. Like
yeah. Yeah.
that ultimately is what I think is so sad about this industry of like health influencers, people who sort of cosplay as experts in the nutrition space or the health space. That is what is so insidious about it, is that like people have no idea the money they're making.
Mm-hmm.
And further, so many times when people are, these influencers or experts are posting online, so many people have no idea that they even make money off of
Yeah.
what they post. And I'm like, that is where I get so, and it's like, if you're in the influencing space, or if you're chronically online, or you're a content creator or whatever, you likely know how this works. You likely can see a post and be like, they might be getting paid for that, and that might not be shown as a branded partnership. Like, that could be a little unethical. You can likely differentiate those posts, but it's like the general public has no concept of what that looks like in this space.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's like the crossover between, just kind of Joe Schmo trusting, Real Food Babe, or like whoever, whatever influencer is telling them that red dye 40 is terrible for you and going to give you cancer. That crossover is so scary. Like, that is the scariest thing I think about our country right now as a whole, is just sort of this lack of critical thinking that goes into their
Media
people's
consumption.
time spent online.
Yeah. The lack of critical thinking and media consumption is probably it's my Roman Empire, honestly.
Mhm.
That is my Roman Empire, is
100%.
lack of critical thinking when it comes to what we're consuming, what the driving motivator is for people to have created this content in the first place. So a lot
Yeah.
of people say, the paid media is designed to like divide us and distract us. That's exactly what they're doing. They
Yeah, the
criticize
mainstream media.
they criticize the media so much, and they're repeating talking points from Fox News, OAN, Newsmax.
Right.
So like not being able to see through that hypocrisy is sad,
Yeah.
and will lead people to being so distracted by the things that don't matter, or don't matter at least as much as what could
Mhm.
actually move the needle in improving our health.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's that promise of like, you can listen to me because I'm not mainstream media and I'm not biased, while I'm also making thousands of dollars from a post about food dye that got 100,000 comments, 200,000 shares. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
the Instagram Reels bonus is a thing. I don't think people understand that the more inflammatory of like a clickbaity type post you make, the more money we make.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I have noticed that even on a little video I posted of dyeing eggs with my 2 year old, 1 year old, I don't remember how old he was at the time. And the amount of comments I had, this was, mind you, like 2 years ago.
Yeah,
So this
yeah.
was before the food dye was like the hot
Yeah.
button topic. And even then I got like, you're a horrible mother for giving your kids food dye and blah blah blah. Like, he's literally dyeing hard-boiled eggs in whipped cream that has dye in it, and like, maybe licked like a little bit.
Right.
Please point me to the scientific research that shows the detrimental effect that will have on my child, proving your point that I'm a bad mother.
Right.
And one of the things that I've noticed that they do, because I've had a lot of these conversations. My husband's been actually having a lot of these conversations, which I'm so proud of him about, is that when you ask them to provide any sort of data,
Mhm.
either it will be from another one of these influencers that has misconstrued the data.
Mhm.
It'll be a study that doesn't actually prove what they're saying it does, or it'll be, or they just won't, and they'll just deflect onto something else. Well, blah blah. Wouldn't you rather just not give them any dyes at all? Like, sure, yeah, like, but that's individualistic thinking. We can all give our kids whatever we want to give them.
Yeah.
So if we can't be talking about like metabolic health in society as a whole, but then think that if we just each individually stop feeding our kids the food dye, it'll like solve this problem. It's just not true. It's not true.
Yeah.
And even
I
the
just
oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, yeah. I mean, excellent, excellent point is that like I would also be curious to know how you deal with this as somebody who is a nutrition educator and like somebody who, you are excellent at like I really aspire to be like you in this way where you you are so good at just like handling the bullshit that people like say to you online and like and I this comment lives rent free in my brain where I think we were texting about something one time and I was like, "Man, how do you deal with like this shit?" Or maybe it was even on our last episode and because I had this video go viral and like people, the comments were popping off and people were just being insane. And you were like, they're just getting me more views. Like, so, and I was like, I love that mentality of just like, yeah, like, listen, have your little arguments that have no scientific, backing behind them in the comments. Feel free, do that because this video will reach the people who it's meant to reach by you doing that, like by you engaging with it. So I loved that like sort of mentality of like, cool, like, yeah, just engage with it more. That's great.
Yeah.
But I was just having a conversation like a couple of weeks ago, just on your point about sort of data and how it's so misconstrued. I was I mentioned something on my Instagram story talking about a surprise, surprise, very popular Mormon influencer who shan't be named, but like super, super, crunchy Mormon mom influencer and lives on her big homestead in Utah, etc. Is married into a billionaire's family. So there you have it. And I was talking about the raw milk consumption with on
Mm-hmm.
my Instagram story. And I want to know your theory on your thoughts on the raw milk situation. But this person came back and was like, you should really look into some of the studies surrounding raw milk. And I was like, okay,
Do your own research.
you have the study that I can look at because I've looked at the studies on pasteurization and how it saves our lives,
Yes.
but like and how foodborne illness was like a very real problem some like I don't know 60, 70 years ago and was like literally killing people. And so I'm sitting here like, cool, so hyped to hear your data. Can you share it? And then it was crickets and I was just like I was like, this is the problem is that like y'all are seeing a trad wife influencer on her homestead in Utah that's worth, 20 mil drink raw milk from her cattle that she milked that morning.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing that happen in real time and thinking, okay, so if I just do that,
Mm-hmm.
then I will aspire to this like lifestyle of, like tradwifery homesteading, like
Yeah.
yassified household labor.
Yeah.
And like that's just not how that works. Like
Mm-hmm.
foodborne illness is still very real. So
Mm-hmm.
like anyway, I would love to know your thoughts on all of that.
You know what we compare this to? I had another one of those light bulb moments. Is it reminds me of the fat free fad of the 90s and how it
Yes.
was like fat is bad, like don't
Yes.
eat fat, and fat is very important. Like we're coming full circle now. We're like, oh, actually now sometimes people are like only eating fat, which is also a problem.
Yeah.
But the whole concept of, the empowerment people feel when they think that they have figured something out that other people don't know is really like, I really think that is somehow the driving motivator behind this like Maha movement too, is like,
Mm,
whether you think you figured out that like pasteurized milk is so bad and so you're drinking raw milk and you think everyone else should, it's just they're just misinformed truth seekers. And so they might have found out, oh, okay, raw milk has some probiotics that we don't get in past or pasteurized milk, but they're not looking at why did we switch from raw milk to pasteurized in the first place. So
Right.
there's that like misinformation where it's like you're not giving the full picture to people because you're not willing to take the time to insert nuance into the topic. And
Mm-hmm.
if everyone just started buying raw milk, I mean, for a time, I don't know if this is still happening or if farmers are like stopping doing this, but farmers would give people raw milk that they weren't able to sell to the big corporations like, I can't even think of one of like the milk brands right now, but one of the big milk
Yeah.
companies because they have very rigorous testing standards. So
Mm-hmm.
think about buying raw milk from farmers that was not extracted or stored or past the test, the rigorous testing that is required for the big bad milk companies that actually have these regulations in place to protect us. So like
Right.
I just what a scary world it would be, or what a scary life it would be to live and think that everyone is out to get you. All of the people that
Yeah.
are dedicated their lives to improving our food supply or creating a larger food supply to sustain our population are just poisoning us.
Mm-hmm.
Because living on a homestead is not realistic for a majority of the population. And so it's,
Unless you are a billionaire,
yes,
like case in point.
case in point. And I think they also see her body and they see her looks
Mm-hmm.
and they see all these things that they aspire to be. So it's just like aspirational content and it should be left at that. It shouldn't be we're like learning something from her content. Her content is not educational. It is
Right.
aspirational. And I think we really need to be more critical of our media consumption in regard to who we're listening to for certain advice. There is one
Mm-hmm.
woman I love, Food Science Babe. I think I sent you her.
Yes. Oh my God. She's iconic.
And she will pull up specific posts from people like Food Babe and say, look, this is straight misinformation. She pulled this picture of this oatmeal cereal and she said there was this list of like 12 ingredients in it. And then I went to the website and I looked up that same cereal and look, there's only 5 ingredients in it. She is lying to you, but because we don't have the time, understandably, I don't expect people to have the time to have to fact check all these people, but because they
Right.
don't have the intellectual honesty to be giving you accurate information, it makes it a very scary territory of, these people are fun to follow or make me feel empowered to follow instead of the people like Food Science Babe that are actually providing you real information. It's
Mm-hmm.
not as clickbaity. It's a 7-minute video that you're going to have to actually like listen to and
Right.
use your like critical thinking skills to understand it. But that's a harder message to sell because
Yeah.
it's clickbait is unfortunately not going anywhere.
Which it's wild that it's a harder conversation to sell when these usually the people who are consuming this type of clickbaity content or taking it at face value are the ones who are like, quote, independent thinkers who have, quote, done extensive research, who have, quote, utilized resources outside of the mainstream media for their news, who, quote, like, I could go on and on. Like these people who really pride themselves on being like the picture of perfection in terms of getting your news and getting your information from sources that are, quote, unbiased. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
no one is really an unbiased source anymore.
No.
And that's what I think is so fascinating about observing like this culture of kind of again this independent thinker, this person who has again quote done a lot of research of their own and things like that. So I find that so fascinating.
Yeah, it's like the very existence of criticism from people kind of like affirms that you're saying something that's legitimate. And it's like,
Mhm.
no, if
Mhm.
you're getting criticized by food scientists because you're sharing information that is inaccurate, that's not
Yeah.
reason to double down. And I think that's what we've noticed really in like the Maha community is when I have
Mm-hmm.
conversations with people and I provide any sort of studies that disprove what they're saying, they just double down or deflect
Yeah.
just into just
Mm-hmm.
another topic that another talking point they've heard. And it's unfortunate because I think a lot of people do these truth seekers do want to have more information to make healthier decisions for their families. I just don't know what the answer is to helping them find people like Food Science Babe that share
Mm-hmm.
evidence based information from reliable sources versus the people that they follow, which share studies from organizations that are funded by insidious
Yeah.
acts or
Mm-hmm.
themselves. I think I remember one that was about food dyes. It was like this Moms for Something group. They funded the study themselves. You can't you can't reference you
Cool, 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 cool.
can't prove your point by like doing a study. Well, it's just like using your child as an example. Like, hey, yeah, if your child displays signs of hyperactivity after eating this, then don't give it to your child. But
Yeah.
also, what else is in it? Is it sugar?
Mm-hmm.
Sugar potentially cause your child to behave more like hyperactively?
Yeah.
Was the combination of carbohydrates, fat, and protein, you know, not something that elicited a, normal digestive response? Was it like a blood sugar rush? That is very
Mm-hmm.
normal and very okay. That's another thing is that's such a tangent, but like glucose spikes, the like fear mongering around glucose spikes is also like so bizarre right now, but
That's like the number one thing I think on my TikTok feed right now is like spiking your blood sugar in the morning, and I'm like, bitch, I just like I stopped honestly at this point. Like I was really doing well with like, having something other than coffee first thing in the morning, and now I'm like, yeah, man, I just don't fucking care. Like yeah, I'm like, no, empty stomach, I'm raw dogging it. Like I
I
don't
loved
care.
that video.
Don't care. No.
You were like, stop talking to me about my cortisol level.
Oh my God. I'm like, listen, I also have like never felt better. So like let me have coffee on an empty stomach, please God. But
I always think about the whole like, did you know if you cut out 1 cup of coffee a day, you can cancel out the little joy you have in life? Like,
literally, that is
accurate.
100% it.
That is.
No, that's so real. But yeah, like I mean, the this is the one thing I was going to bring up. I have this friend who we started, we met online like most of my friends now. And so we just started, chit-chatting about things. I've been a huge fan of hers for well over a year. I followed her for a long time, and she saw a video of mine on TikTok where I was sort of, critiquing this very popular podcast and how they started bringing on sort of like a ton of people who were spewing misinformation about people's health.
Mhm.
Anyway, she reaches out to me and she's like, or she posted my video on her Instagram story. We follow each other. I ask her to be on the podcast. She's coming on in a couple of weeks. And one thing that's fascinating about her content is that she talks a lot about fast fashion and sort of like the
Mm.
circular economy, and that's like the premise of a lot of her content. But she also talks a lot about politics and how that plays a role in sort of like greenwashing fashion, and like how we think about fashion from a economic standpoint and how we think about fashion from a consuming standpoint.
Mhm.
So she made a fabulous point that the way that algorithms work, she also has a background in ad tech, so I think this is really also quite fascinating. The way that algorithms work is that, this was something I didn't know, is that the content that you consume starts to basically tell the algorithm that the people in your circles also want to consume that content.
Mhm. Yep. And feeder
So
accounts. Yeah.
I had no idea that that was like even a thing, which makes so much sense now. Obviously, I'm like, oh yeah, duh. Like that would totally make sense that my best friend's content consumption would also inform my content consumption. But where this gets so interesting is that, like, if somebody clicks on a clickbait article on Instagram and then goes down this rabbit hole of like raw milk, red dye 40, whatever it is, and they're, going through an account and then they're liking posts on that account, or even worse, saving them,
Mm-hmm.
that informs the algorithm that like their closest friends who they also like the posts of want to see more content like that.
Mm-hmm.
So like I heard this and I went through my Instagram and I was like unfollow, 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 because I was like, I know y'all are consuming some whack ass shit and I don't want any part of it. So it's scary. I was like, so all of these people are also informing the content I consume, which makes total sense when we think about like echo chambers and how they're formed,
Mm-hmm.
specifically with like within the alt-right. So yeah,
Oh, and it,
fascinating.
it makes a lot of sense that the algorithm would be doing this because even Google will be like location specific. So I live in a town that I can confidently say is an echo chamber because of all the people I talk to that repeat the same things to me. And even if you Google something, the exact same question, I think a lot of people still aren't aware that someone's page, that first page of Google, will look different depending on where you live and depending on what your previous search history has suggested.
Yes.
For instance, like I never see anything like from Fox News pop up unless
Yeah.
it's on someone else's, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Not screen grab, but went remix. If they remix the
Yeah.
reel, and so they put it in the beginning, and then I have to, I try to. God, even saying this makes me makes me sound like I'm just saying this, but I try to obtain and absorb like what all of the different types of media are saying because I think it helps in conversations with people.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
but I feel like that's what everyone says these days. You know what I mean? I get my information. I have all sorts of different sources for my information. You know what I mean? But it's like I have to go out of my way then to find that because I never like it and I never share it and none of my friends share it with me. So it's like if I
Yeah.
find something else like that, like my Google search won't even pull that up. Whereas, yeah, if you, and also for people listening, I live in the middle of like a cornfield. I have no neighbors. Like, so I feel like my algorithm and my, whether it's Google, Instagram, whatever, is like so specific. And
Yeah.
I'm becoming more addicted to my phone, as we all are, because I'm like, ooh, I do want to watch this video. Ooh, I do want to hear this like 7-minute saga of this girl like debunking these things. They know exactly what I want to hear. And they've reeled me in just like they've reeled you in, all of us in, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, what you're saying, I think it's so important for people to hear that and to understand the
Mhm.
insidiousness of that. I love that we're using that word like so much. People are probably like, oh my God, think of a different word, girls.
It's
But it's
insidious.
insidious. But
No, literally.
you're so right. And
Spooky.
I think your friend, this might be the same friend you're talking about. In her video, she said, actually, there is feeder accounts. Was this the same girl? She
Yeah. Yeah. It's
said,
Heidi. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I knew about like the friends algorithm thing. I didn't understand how big of an impact feeder accounts had. So for
Yeah.
people listening who don't know what that means, there are certain accounts that if you start following them or you start sharing or liking a lot of their information, your algorithm is going to be primed with all of this other information. So just like you were saying, Maggie, you like
Mhm.
one thing about raw milk, then all of a sudden every other post you see is about raw milk. Well, it's the same with these accounts. You like one, truth seeker or like independent thinkers, for during COVID, they were actually targeting chiropractors. So if
Yeah.
you had anything about chiropractic medicine, I use that term. Yeah. Chiro- anything about anything about chiropractic, uh, job, the
If
job, the
you're a
job,
chiropractor, don't listen to this episode.
the job of chiropractors. Hey, I have a good friend who's a chiropractor, and you know what? She's very like she draws a hard line with what she is able to talk about with her patients and what
Mhm.
she's able to do with her patients. So I know if she listens to this, she's going to agree with, a lot of.
I literally have a chiropractor, and my chiropractor is, it's like chiropractic care is like kind of the one like very crunchy thing I still incorporate into my life.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that my chiropractor is, her and her husband are, they went to Palmer in the Quad
Hmm.
Cities, and they are the most intelligent, like lovely people. And they are very much the same way. They're like, we draw a hard line
Yeah.
of like what we talk about with patients and when we refer them
Yes.
to a specialist. So,
Yes.
anyway,
Scope of practice. That's all we're
yes.
asking for. Stay within your
From everyone, really, is
from
scope of
everyone.
practice.
Please stay within your scope of practice. And even for us, like when I was doing one-on-ones, I was so careful with even the wording in which I phrased my programs on my, PDF like pricing list. I was so
Yeah.
careful because I did not want to step outside of my scope of practice. For some reason, it almost is like legitimatizing people who step out of their scope of practice in this Maha movement. It's like, oh, you were a doctor, but then you quit, or you never actually practiced as a doctor, and somehow that gives you more legitimacy in
Yeah.
talking to us about our health. Like, what? But anyways, back to what I was originally saying. So Facebook identified anything, about being a chiropractor on people's page, and they started feeding them anti-mask, anti-vax, like all this information. So they didn't even need to follow or like any page that was associated with that. They were able to just identify that these people look for quote unquote alternative medicine or alternative health practices, and in so doing, they are more likely to eat up this information about anti-mask and anti-vax conspiracy theories. And it's like, if people just had that kind of information, that what our algorithms are feeding us is meant to keep us addicted to our phones, I think they
Hmm.
would look at the information a little bit more critically.
Yeah. Oh my God. That's so real. I literally wrote down a line for, I'm I have been in the process of writing a like sort of subsequent Substack piece to go along with an episode like this, where,
Mm,
we're talking about sort of independent thinking and how people are getting their news and misinformation in terms of health and all of that. And one of the lines I wrote down the other night was that, I literally put it over here, is that if women had a moment to pay attention, they'd employ arguably the most dangerous weapon in their arsenal to fight back against these institutions, which is their anger. And that
ooh,
is like my utmost and firm belief, is that there are so many institutions out there that are so afraid of women getting angry. And
mhm,
because what happens when women get angry is they vote. And what happens when women vote is that people are put into office who actually support other women. And so that, I think, is like that was sort of the, I was taking all these notes on this episode and pulling from this piece I had been writing, and I was like, what is sort of the common thread here? And the thread that I found the most compelling, I think, is that all of this, the misinformation, the independent thinker, crunchy to alt-right pipeline,
mhm,
the, roundtable discussions on health with people who are ENTs talking about nutrition, the like all of it all comes back to this concept of like keeping people busy, keeping women really entrenched in these topics that they really have no business being entrenched in, and because other people have done the work for them,
yes.
and keeps them sort of constantly questioning, the big man and like corporations and big government. And if we could just have small government, then small government would change everything and be our fix for all of these problems.
Mhm.
And small government is how we, get to getting our freedoms back, blah blah blah. And it's like,
Which is a contradiction in itself when it comes to
exactly,
like
exactly. It's like this all is reliant upon constant contradictions and
you said.
constant sort of displacement of attention. And that displacement is so scary to observe firsthand.
And we can ask ourselves, is the timing coincidental that Roe v. Wade got overturned? Women started turning against the party that was actively trying to strip us of our rights. And then all of a sudden, how do we recapture the vote of the white suburban mom? This.
Yeah.
Got
Yeah.
it.
Exactly.
Look at their social media consumption. Where is there already a lot of that anger, like you talked about? That is so like bingo. How do we get them angry about a topic again? And that's how the whole abortion debate, that's how abortion became a political issue in the first place. There's a really amazing NPR episode about like the Ronald Reagan era, where abortion, like evangelicals didn't even really care about abortion. All of a sudden they were like, actually, we want to continue being able to segregate schools. So we need to pull the vote from people who might not really support segregating schools, but we have to get them to care about something else. What can we focus on? Abortion. And so all of a sudden, they posed it as the unborn is like the unborn needs our protection more than anyone else, even the mother. And so that's how this all came to be. And now we're seeing that happen again with like, okay, we have all of these health promoting policies that we know would make America healthier. A certain party is actively campaigning against those policies. In order to distract people from the fact that they are actively campaigning against those policies, i.e., food gouging, i.e., food assistance that would make people, especially the low income population, able to actually afford less processed foods, i.e., reducing the demand, i.e., preventing these big corporations from being able to sell as much processed foods. Instead of paying attention to those things, they would rather you focus on the pseudoscience and individual ingredients. And that is their ticket to winning elections, is distract, deflect, focus on what is going to anger women to regain their vote, and therefore continue the patriarchal, the misogyny, all of the other practices that really, really affect women right now.
Yeah.
More so than food dye.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Exquisite. I also I love that you bring sort of this concept of misogyny and patriarchy back into the conversation, because like that's to make this a full circle moment. It's like when we're thinking about the women who are doing the doctor's appointments and doing the research for what recipes they're making at night for their family and doing the grocery shopping and doing all of this like, household labor and taking on the mental load of that labor, that is where I think women really fail to realize like how we got to that point in the first place. Like, how did we get to a place where women are now the sole party responsible for that mental load? And like, I talked about the movie and book Fair Play on my Instagram story the other day, and I got tons of DMs from people who were like, "What is this book? Tell me more about this book." And I'm like, "Oh my god, if you haven't read Fair Play, it's like I love this book so much because it talks about the disproportionate mental load that women carry within households, especially households that have children, and how you can work to divvy that mental load in a way that, will help you avoid divorce, essentially, like basically. And what I love about it is that like there's a card game that goes along with it where you can basically like divvy up piles of what household and mental load that labor is being done by each partner. So like say if I'm taking out the trash, I could pull a card for that into my pile. And I've had friends who have played it. I've never played it because quite frankly, like I feel very, very much so that my spouse and I are very even keel on like what we do around the house in terms of mental load and all of that. But I've had friends who have played it who have been like, I just want to see where this goes. And like almost all of them are like, yeah, we started couples counseling. Like we just really like, and I'm like, you know what, that's great. Like, talk about the patriarchy, talk about how that affects your marriage, because like that is so often a topic that like everyone avoids because they think it's like a buzzwordy type thing, but it's like the patriarchy harms us all, like
Hmm.
even men. So like it's just I wish that more people sort of took a moment to understand like where this is all stemming from in the first place and
Hmm.
how it is just keeping women specifically so busy,
Hmm.
so consumed, and keeping them from realizing the actual factors at play that
Hmm.
harm them.
You know what I just realized when you were talking about that is this obsession with European culture when it comes to ingredients in our foods, but they don't look at the European culture when it comes to the even divide of household labor and the fact
Yes.
that homeschooling is not a thing over there. Like, I
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure for some cultures there is. I shouldn't say it's not a thing. But for the European cultures they're talking about, it's not a thing. And that
Mhm.
is one of my biggest talking points, if you will, that I like to hear from people about is like, what European countries are you referring to when it comes to processed foods and food dyes and things? Because everywhere I've gone in Europe, there's a heck of a lot of processed foods. Like you can go
Yeah.
to any grocery store that I've been to in Europe has many options. And just because they put different preservatives and different food dyes in their food doesn't mean that they're healthier. In fact,
Mhm.
more of their food dyes are likely to cause allergic reactions than the food dyes that we have that are, you know, I guess less natural, but natural doesn't necessarily mean better. Just like
Right.
organic versus inorganic fruits and vegetables. Just because it's organic doesn't mean that the pesticides that they use are going to be better for your health. You
Mhm.
could put lead on something and call it organic because lead is a
Mhm.
naturally occurring organism, you know? So it would be really interesting if we're going to talk about Europe, let's dive further into the like mental load of, women over there, how, how they balance their work and life and, duties with their spouse. It'd be interesting. I've never really even
Well,
thought of that in the conversation.
one of the like my favorite things about people who bring up the European country argument, who by the way are mostly people who identify again as like these truth-seeking folks,
Yeah.
done my own research, etc., is that like most of the time the countries they are referencing are socialist countries.
Yes.
And so I'm like, so girly, are you proposing then
Uh,
that you like socialism? I'm like, so you're essentially proving my point, which is that
yes.
like government practices where, or government mandated practices, I guess, policies where women have an opportunity to share that mental load with their partner because they have paid maternal leave, because they have support after giving birth, because they have, someone coming to their home to check on them after they have given birth, because they have, affordable childcare, because they have schools that they trust and believe in, because
Hmm.
they, trust their neighbors to take care of their children as well, because they can go into a grocery store and leave their stroller outside. Like, because their children can ride the subway alone, like, throughout the day.
Yeah.
I'm like, you realize what kind of government they have, right? Like, I'm like, so are you a Marxist then? Like,
Oh, that, yes. And there are so many posts that I have seen from people that I know to be very right wing that will talk or that will post about like, why don't we have more like maternal care? Why don't we have like and what? Come over, come. You're so close. You are
yeah,
so
yeah,
close. We welcome you with open arms. Like, I promise you'll like it much better over here.
literally.
You'll be much happier. You will feel you will feel understood.
Right, exactly.
So leaving the
Yeah, that's
strollers out.
fascinating.
Yeah,
It's like you are so close yet so far from like what we are trying to say here.
yes,
Like,
yes.
but I would love to know kind of, maybe in wrapping up this exquisite conversation, which I could keep going for literally. I mean, I think we should just start a podcast about this, but
I think we should.
I would love to know if you think there is, as a nutrition educator, as somebody who's so informed in regards to not only nutrition and health education, and you have the credentialing for it, but also somebody who's incredibly informed in terms of like governmental policies. I would love to know if you think there is actually a danger presented with our food system as it stands.
Ooh, that's a great question. I think we have to refer back to the whole concept of the dose makes the poison, right? Like,
Mm,
you can't call something poisonous without knowing the dose. You can die because you drank too much water. Like, people have
yeah.
literally died from drinking too much water. And I think it always has to be looked at as in a, like a problem solving metric too, of like what is having the most impact, where are the problems stemming from, and then how are we going to solve that. I absolutely think everyone should strive to reduce their consumption of processed food. I absolutely think for children to have the amount of processed food they consume when it comes to hyper palatable foods, that is a bigger issue to look at, because I have worked with all ages. I think the oldest person I've worked with was maybe like 84. The youngest was
Wow.
4, 5, 5.
Mhm.
And so seeing that our relationships with food and our health risk factors really start in our youth. You can look at that, with diabetes, that a lot of our behaviors, even as children, can contribute to diabetes later in life. We have to look at what is the biggest contributing factor. And hyperpalatable food creates much more difficulty in consuming fruits and vegetables, in consuming herbs instead of just using like salt as a seasoning, for instance. So I should kind of backtrack. And when I say hyperpalatable, I'm talking about foods that have high sweetness, high
Mhm.
saltiness, and generally are a consistent texture. So I bet any
Mhm.
mom listening to this is probably like, yep, that's
Yeah.
exactly what my children want. Mac and cheese, which, okay, I have to.
That's what adults want, man. Like
We all want hyperpalatable foods. That is what has like a dopamine response in our minds.
Mhm.
And so I would say if we're looking at something that is more dangerous, it is an overconsumption of hyperpalatable processed foods that makes it much harder for us to implement those healthier foods into our diets. So I think
Mhm.
learning how to cook quick meals, that's my biggest passion, is helping people cook quick meals, homemade meals. Like, just like, we don't have time to do
Yeah.
elaborate meals as, parents, and a lot of people who work multiple jobs don't have time for it either, even if they don't have kids. So how can we use whole food ingredients, make the meals, make the little bars? Like, for instance, we buy a bar that's just nuts and dried fruit, like blended together. Of course, in my mind, I'm like, yeah, why don't I just like make that myself? That's not that hard.
Yeah.
But because they're so easily accessible at the grocery store, like, yeah, I'm just going to buy that. But that is a privilege that I have, in that I can
Mhm.
buy the more expensive, like, health food aisle ingredients. And a lot of people can't
Mhm.
do that. So for the
Yeah.
people that can't, how can we help them cook, with beans and eggs, and, make more nutritive like pasta dishes? Because if we can help them do that, then that is the power that they need to reduce their consumption of processed food. And of course, the price, which we've already talked about.
Right. That's so good. I I love that you bring in that like this is a our food system in America is not something to like be feared, where there are certain aspects of it where yes, like we could always do better. That's
Yeah.
fundamentally I would say that that's probably any country like established, like any, you know, established nation could do better as it relates to the health of their citizens. Like, yeah. But like, I love that you bring in that the dose is so important here, because that's how so much of this fear mongering begins in the first place, is people just being like, okay, again, black and white, all or nothing thinking, Roundup weed killer is bad. And it's like, well, actually it helps if you don't want weeds. Like, so it's
Yeah.
like there's so many like little distinctions like that, where I'm like, and also you have to look at that dosage, and you have to look at things with a more critical lens. And so, and especially as it relates to like, how we create food for our children and how we bring all of this into the household. Like, that's what I love so much about your content, is that I've implemented so many of your recipes into our, kind of like nightly routine, because, or, dinner routine, because they're easy. And like, usually I can make them with stuff I already have laying around. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so that's what I think people are missing, is that like, it's not hard to make a healthy, dinner. Of course, if you are a privileged person living in America, it's
Yeah.
not hard to make, a healthy, quick dinner, if you can step back and be like, oh, like, even though this isn't gluten free, dairy free, nut free, allergen free, like whatever it is, even though it might not be all of those things, it's still ticking the boxes on an adequate amount of protein, carbs, fats,
Mm-hmm.
in that sort of equal or, appropriate amount. And also it's relatively, like, it's pretty healthy for the most
Yeah.
part. Like, and that's, I think people have lost the concept of like just doing their best as it relates to the food that they consume and everything they consume, really.
Yeah. Well, I would love to hear your take too on whatever you're comfortable with sharing, but on the potential damage that will be done to children when their parents are consuming this type of single ingredient fear mongering and pseudoscience
Mhm.
around this,
Yeah.
because I think the anxiety that adults feel is so easily passed on to children.
Yeah.
And whether it is whether it comes out as anxiety in their child, or whether it comes out in a level of like bullying other kids because they're not eating the way that their parents say, I think there are a lot of consequences that we are going to see within children because of the food mongering and the pseudoscience surrounding this movement. And I'm curious, as you know, from your experience with things, whatever you're comfortable sharing, like how do you see that impacting kids as their parents are kind of absorbing all of this information from people like Food Babe and other
Yeah.
creators?
It's a great question. I think, like, when I was growing up, my mom always, I feel very lucky to have like grown up with my parents, obviously, because I love them and they're amazing. But I think one of the things my mom instilled in me as a child was that my mom could make something out of nothing. Like, she literally would just come home, look around our kitchen, and it should be noted too, like, at one point in my parents' lives, before I was born, but when my older 2, 3 siblings were born, that my parents were at one point on food stamps. So my parents had, this sort of food scarcity that was happening at one point in their lives, and also happening in the lives of my 2, 3 oldest siblings. I never experienced that, because by the time I came around, my parents were making more money, they had different jobs, like, etc. But I think that sort of like food scarcity, certainly, I'm sure my oldest siblings would say, played a role in the way that they viewed how they cook meals, how they prepare, food for themselves and for their families. I am sure that that made an impact. So when we think about like food scarcity like that, or, the concept of like maybe not having enough, and then we look at like our culture now, which is so inundated with everything. Most of us have more than enough. Like, we are, I would say the vast majority of privileged Americans have so much to do with it. That's where a lot of this, kind of confusion comes into play, is that we have so much information, we don't know what to do with it. We have so much offered to us that we don't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And what a privilege that is. But I think, like, one thing, again, my mom instilled in me was just like, make do with what you have, and that's good enough, and that's going to be fine. And the detriment that this will have on children, I think, is I don't necessarily know how it will impact kids in terms of like, when they grow up and have their own families and things of that nature. But I think in the immediate, like next 5 to 10 years, the uptick in orthorexia that you're going to see, the uptick in eating disorders, generally speaking, is going to be insane.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because so much of this is sort of closeted or disguised orthorexia. Like a lot of it is just like being so hyper aware of what you're consuming that it becomes a problem. And as somebody who identifies with having had orthorexia at one point in my life, and should be noted, I was eating paleo at the time,
Mm-hmm.
that that I think is going to be the biggest issue we'll see amongst kids. And like to your point, other factors where there's almost a moral hierarchy that kids will start to view of like, well, my mom shopped at Whole Foods and my mom got all organic stuff and my mom only made meals with 2 or 3 ingredients, whereas like my mom growing up shopped at Aldi. I knew what Aldi was before it was cool. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I like my mom always got 69-cent cream of mushroom soup and then put that in with like a couple of other things into a dish and I turned out just fucking fine. So it's this concept of like, making there's a way to do it in a way where like there's a way to do this where you have to because you are food scarce and
Yeah.
you don't have the money to afford healthy food for your family. And then there's another side of on the opposite end of the spectrum is like, well, I'm doing it with as minimal ingredients as possible because I have orthorexia
Mm.
and am quite possibly passing this trait to my children while they observe everything I'm doing and making these meals for my family. So like, I think that's the biggest detriment we're going to see is that these kids are going to grow up having such a skewed idea of what it means to be, quote, healthy,
Yeah.
and that will require a massive amount of undoing
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And your family was a good example of, yeah, making it work with what they had,
Right.
with using single ingredients and like whole
Mhm.
foods. And I think that question of what it is going to do to people who are absorbing this content, I guess my biggest curiosity would be, are these people hearing this and yeah, leaning toward that route of like, okay, we're not going to let any of this in our house, we're not going to buy any of this, whatever, which if you have that as a rule without letting your kids in on kind of like the fear around it, I think that could maybe work if you give them a little more free reins when they're like at friends' houses and stuff. I've heard a lot of
Mhm.
creators be like, well, I don't give my kids this, but I'm not going to tell them they can't have it when they're like out and about and whatever. So there's that section of the people with this information. But then I think there's the other section of people with this information that is just giving them more anxiety, but they're not actually knowing what to do about it because they don't necessarily have the time to look through all the ingredients and they don't even know what half the ingredients mean. I think a lot of people reference like, look at how long this ingredient list is, and it's a fortified item, which means half of the
Mhm.
ingredients that you see are vitamins and minerals that
Yeah.
have been added in, which that's a whole another, large movement in our nation to fortify products with vitamins and nutrients that they saw kids being malnourished in.
Mhm.
But I do wonder if people who are feeling fear around this topic have taken a hard and honest look at their child's media consumption or television consumption or screen time.
Mm.
Have they looked
Mhm.
at the product as a whole? Because certain people that are wanting food dyes taken out don't even give their kids stuff with food dyes currently. It's again just like a
Yeah.
little bit of a scapegoat. So I fear that, yeah, what you're saying is, the orthorexia is definitely going to go up because I think people are
Mhm.
already feeling that fear around these ingredients. But then it's also going to excuse them from not taking a harder look at the things that have been proven to disrupt children's brains when it comes to hyperactivity and things like screen time. And
Yeah.
I give my kids screen time. Like I'm not someone who's ever going to criticize a mom because of what she's feeding her kids or what, you know, the amount of screen time they get.
Right.
But I just think there's so many factors that would be more productive for us to focus on. And I think we're letting the pseudoscience and the sphere mongering around the single ingredients distract us and almost remove culpability in the other things we could be doing to make our family healthier.
Yeah. Mm. Yes. Absolutely. Like 110%. Just that. Yeah. That's exquisite. Okay. I love that. That's amazing. I think that's a good ending
I love that.
note.
Yeah.
Okay, Erin, any last notes on the topic? Any last maybe advice you would give to somebody who is like dealing with sort of consuming this misinformation, hearing their friends consume this misinformation and like having to deal with their friends in this kind of setting? Anything like that? Any advice you would give to somebody in those scenarios?
Yeah, I could use that advice myself, honestly. I feel like
Tell them to fuck off. No, I'm just kidding.
I well, so what I've um had success with, I will say,
Mhm.
is when these conversations get brought up is generally it's just kind of like an overarching statement that they'll say. For instance, I had a great conversation with someone who was at an influencer retreat with me last week, and she considers herself to be a crunchy mom, and she makes sourdough and she drinks the raw milk, but she's also very down to earth, and she is also, you know, someone who is going to be very open to more information. So she
Mhm.
was talking about like European food standards and just, you know, made some sort of statement about, well, they have much healthier food in Europe or something like that. And I think just having the education from people like Food Science Babe and other creators that kind of debunk certain talking points is really helpful. I don't know if maybe we could link some like sources in the description
Absolutely.
of this podcast that people can go to seek better information, because I really think that's what it comes down to is if we are armed with information and we feel confident speaking on these topics, we're more likely to talk about them calmly and bring nuance into the conversation. So I think
Mhm.
anytime you can maybe ask questions, bring nuance into the conversation. The glyphosate was a really good example, like the Roundup you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, the residue of glyphosate on these fruits, vegetables, bonza pasta was so infinitesimal that you would have to consume enormous amounts to
Right.
reach the maximum daily limit of glyphosate or, you know, pesticide consumption. And I think that's the nuance that's kind of being missed is, you know, if someone has any sort of they are poisoning us type rhetoric, we have to bring nuance into the conversation. Like that is I
Yeah.
think that is our job, especially as like health professionals. Let's bring more nuance into the conversation. Let's talk about the dosage. Again, the dose makes the
Mhm.
poison, and how much are we really consuming? And if is that amount we're consuming detrimental to our health?
Yeah.
So for instance, with the glyphosate too, there's been a really interesting and scary uptick in cancer in Iowa. We have the fastest growing rate of new cancers and the second growing rate of like cancers overall. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. And so there could absolutely be ties to the glyphosate and the pesticides that are sprayed on the corn.
Mhm.
So, one very interesting thing that's happening in Iowa legislature right now is the GOP majority Senate passed a bill that says that Iowans cannot sue pesticide manufacturers if they get cancer. So, again, the contradiction in the MAHA movement supporting this party that is actually trying to make it harder for us to take back our
Yeah.
health and fight against these corporations, they're not asking the right questions. I think that's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're asking all these questions. They're trying to poke holes in all of these, truths or supposed truths or whatever, but they're not asking the right questions. A right question in this would be, why are why is our legislature trying to prevent us from suing these manufacturers unless there's something that they're trying to hide and that they know that
Right.
they are culpable in,
Mm-hmm.
causing. And so, yeah, just with RFK having this history with Monsanto and like winning cases against them, it's like, I wish I could get all of this information out to people. I think
Yeah.
that is what, you know, makes me want to get more involved in politics, is just knowing that there's so much information and so much contradiction that needs to be spotlighted, and it's so
Mm-hmm.
hard to spotlight this contradiction and within the parties, within whatever, without having, more of like a role in the government. So
Yeah.
I hope that kind of information starts somehow becoming more mainstream, even though a lot of people hate mainstream media. But it's like we have to know that. I guarantee you, majority of Iowans don't know that our GOP majority Senate passed that bill. So
It's crazy.
lots to unpack.
Wow. Well, Erin, you are just an icon, and I appreciate you so much for coming on again and sharing all of your wisdom. Remind people where they can find you, your handles, all the good stuff.
Yeah. So Instagram's All Inspired Wellness. TikTok is Erin_Dittmer, and website is erindittmer.com. So,
Perfect.
but
And we'll link
also,
that show notes.
thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, though, if I can recommend people from this episode to go anywhere, it would definitely be Food Science Babe. And we'll link a couple other ones in the show
Yes,
notes.
absolutely. Yeah. I think her name's Andrea Love, who I really love as well. There's a few others. Yeah, we'll link them in the show notes and people can do a deep dive on all of that.
Love that.
So
Well, thanks for
amazing.
chatting. This was
Well, thanks for
cathartic.
coming on.